Uh, Thank you very much. I'm excited to give this talk. It's my first time, and I'm going to talk about something that I haven't been in a while, which is an economist. So tonight I'm going to be talking about income targeting and surge pricing. I'm the VP of Analytics at Zenefits, but tonight I'll be a data scientist from Uber. Zenefits is the all-in-one HR platform, and I work with a great team doing data work there. So again, tonight I'm going to be an economist, so I'm going to start off with a quick lesson in traditional economics about how people respond to prices. So in economics, we talk a lot about supply and demand curves. This is a specific supply curve. It's the labor supply curve. And we have prices on the vertical axis, quantities on the horizontal axis. And typically, what economists think is that as you offer people a higher and higher wage, they supply more labor, so that the supply curve is upward sloping. This actually happens to be the case that it bends backwards once you start to get to really extreme wages. And only when you get to extreme wages does the income effect, which is the effect of being wealthier and wanting to take more leisure time, dominate the substitution effect, which says if you have the opportunity to earn more money, go out and do it. So that's what traditional economics would say. Behavioral economics, which leverages concepts from psychology to make economic predictions, has this premise called prospect theory, which comes out of Kahneman and Tversky. And in the 70s, Kahneman and Tversky posited that people have a very narrow view of their choices. They're thinking about it in a certain context with a certain reference point. And around that reference point, they're really, really sensitive. They hate losses. They like gains, but then there's sort of diminishing sensitivity, so that, basically they really dislike losses. So once you sort of violate the reference point a little, it feels really bad. And this is one of the reasons why people are averse to really small gambles. People tend to select the status quo. People have the endowment effect, which basically means that we're more likely to keep the things we have. And this all comes out of prospect theory. But one of the really interesting predictions of prospect theory comes from a paper from 1997, which is about taxi drivers in New York City. And these taxi drivers exhibited a behavior called income targeting. And what income targeting is that the taxi drivers have a certain income target, and they work really hard to get up to that income target, and then they drop off. They don't go out and earn more and more money. And this sort of violates traditional economics, because what income targeting predicts is that as wages are really high, people actually work less. Whereas when wages are really low, people work really hard to get to the target. Now, taxi driving is a really nice context to study income targeting for a few reasons. The first is that in New York City, most sort of taxi services, the driver rents the cab for a certain number of hours, and they can use it as much or as little of that time as they want. They pay the gate fee, and then they can go out and earn as much as they want. Secondly, it has the practice of the wages are flexible. So taxi drivers with having sort of schedules that are flexible are sort of unlike, say, a waiter or that might have a very flexible, a very variable wage, similar to taxi drivers, because maybe it's a very busy day in the restaurant versus not. But the taxi drivers can actually skip the last half of their shift. The wages fluctuate in a specific way when it comes to taxi driving. Obviously, sometimes it's very busy, so the drivers can earn a lot of money, and sometimes it's not so busy. But the important thing is that wages are correlated within the day. Sort of within certain periods, wages are correlated. So if it's a busy time, after you drop off the person, it's probably going to be still busy. So what Kammerer found was that the drivers did not respond in the traditional economics way. So this is the results from the appendix. And the key result is that the coefficient from a regression of hours on many variables, but most importantly, the wage, showed that none of these coefficients look like +1. So, and you can clearly reject a big positive coefficient. In fact, most of the coefficients in all of the different specifications look like they're negative, meaning that as wages go up, people work fewer hours. So this is very counterintuitive. You would think that if someone were offering a higher wage, if you're not like Bill Gates, you would end up seeing more and more hours worked. Instead, actually, they find exactly the opposite. One of the things to note about this result is that it's a result of an instrumental variable regression. So the authors basically don't use the sort of self-reported wage. They use they basically do a two-stage regression where they first fit essentially what they expect the wage to be for a given hour, given certain characteristics of the day, whether it was raining, whether it's like a big event, whether other drivers are able to pick up people quickly. So, so this is actually going to come in a little bit later into my talk. The key result of this paper is that, there's a negative-ish coefficient on wages, which is somewhat surprising. So I wanted to sort of think about this in the context of Uber and Lyft these days. So if you haven't been living on planet Earth for the last few years, Uber and Lyft are ride-sharing services. Uber's mission is that you push a button and get a ride in minutes. And if you are like me, a big consumer of Uber and Lyft, you may have encountered, much to your dismay, Lyft prime time or Uber surge pricing. And what those are when demand is ahead of supply, Uber or Lyft will adjust the prices, and you typically face a higher than standard fare. And prices are going to be the mechanism by which they're going to sort of make supply and demand meet. So Uber and Lyft prime time. So these authors take a look at Uber surge pricing. These are two members of the data science team at Uber and a professor at the University of Chicago. And they wanted to look at what happens when Uber does surge pricing. And so they're going to look at two events where there were surges. So the first was an Ariana Grande concert at Madison Square Garden, which was, of course, sold out because it's Ariana Grande. And then they also looked at New Year's Eve and some of the dynamics that happened on New Year's Eve. And they're really interested in what was the welfare, the total welfare of sort of the Uber community. So what that means is basically, well, you know, obviously as the prices go up, I'm a little bit more annoyed, but that money gets transferred to presumably a happier driver. And they think that the total welfare is going to increase for basically two reasons. The first is that you know, the lower value riders that are going to be less inclined to actually request a ride, and second, that more drivers are going to sort of flood to that area, making more matches happen, increasing the total happiness of the Uber community. So they're really focused on the economic efficiency of surge, and that was sort of this was from the policy team, and that was the point of this paper. So what happened with the Ariana Grande concert? So at Madison Square Garden, the concert gets out, and they have a really nice graph depicting the percentage increase from the pre-surge levels. So what happened, I think color-wise we're doing OK. If you can see kind of the yellow period is the surge period. The red dots on this graph on the upper right represent people opening up the Uber application. So you can see as the concert gets out, a lot of people are opening up the Uber application, a lot more than before. The blue dots, pictured here, are people requesting a ride. So it's push a button, but it's actually, there's two steps. You first have to open the application. You might see that the prices are surging, but then what happens? Do you request a ride? And the green dots are actually what's the driver supply looking like for I guess, Midtown West or the greater Madison Square Garden area. So the first thing that the authors note are that the customers actually do respond to surge pricing. They see that the prices are higher, and then there's a behavioral response. So even though a lot of people are opening the application, because there's a surge, they actually show that even though you've got more people opening the application, fewer are actually requesting a ride. So it actually gets the lower value folks to delay requesting a ride. The next thing is that drivers are more likely to go towards the Madison Square Garden area. So basically, what they find is that surge works, that basically they have this metric called completion rate. Does it meet the mission? Does it get these connections in under a certain amount of time? And that seems to work. The next is New Year's Eve. They look at what happened on New Year's Eve. So New Year's Eve is a typical time where you see a lot of surging because you have a lot of people who want to go out and have a good time on New Year's Eve, and then they need a ride home. So Uber had this technical glitch happen with their software, and as a result, there was an outage in their surge pricing for a certain amount of time. And what the authors show is that this outage creates a nice natural experiment, and that with this glitch, you see that the ETAs spike. So without surge, the whole ecosystem doesn't quite work. What I wanted to say was, it's nice that these results show the impact of surge. I think they left a little bit of meat on the bone, because I think there's a lot of rich data here to talk about the subsequent behavior. While Uber was still surging, shows a pretty low set of ETAs given the spikes in demand. So that even though those drivers who were out on New Year's Eve probably earned a fair amount of money in this zone, they were still driving later in that evening. So basically, this is an example of sort of what traditional economics would predict, that high wages yield continued service. So a different paper by another author from Uber and an economist at Princeton showed that Uber drivers are, they've got a lot of things going on. They value flexibility. They have outside options. They have other jobs. They vary their hours a lot more than other jobs. So it might be the case that the Uber drivers that we see responding in the traditional economics way are a particularly opportunistic set. So I think that there's sort of some open questions as to what is driving this Uber behavior. So a couple of quick notes in my last few minutes. What I really liked about this paper is I'm just super jealous. They have a really novel, really extensive, really awesome data set. And there's a lot of interesting questions that fall out of it. The results are simple, clear, and robust. There's many contexts in which they show it. The results are observable in, the results are very observable in the pictures and not just the specification. And last, they make the most of a natural experiment. They really think deeply about whether or not a natural experiment has occurred, because typically, if you think about the completion metric, typically what you would see is the completion metric going down whenever prices are surging. Because, of course, the reason that they're having a surge pricing is because the completion metric is going down. So you typically have a really tough time studying something like surge pricing and its impact, because the causality is exactly the opposite direction. You have like a circle. What I didn't like about this paper, so they picked a measure of responsiveness that shows that basically Uber achieves its goal 100% of the time, rather than a more sensitive one, sort of giving us a richer sense for what's happening to the total welfare of the environment. Secondly, they don't look at what happens in the other neighborhoods. That yes, a lot of cabs are going towards MSG. What's happening in Midtown East? What's happening on the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side? And of course, my biggest gripe and most justifiable gripe is a lot of this data, the full, complete, rich data set is still sort of internal, right? You can imagine that they're a business with their top priority being, of course, protecting their data. And last, the shocks that they talk about are not unpredictable. So if I open my application on New Year's Eve and see that the surge price is 2x, this might actually be like, wow, it's 50% off. So I think it would have been nice to see another example where the surge was in response to a more surprising event. So last, I think there's, I guess the point of this talk is to say there was an incredibly rich data set that Lyft and Uber have that can inform a lot of how we think about variable wages, that can think about how these drivers are, what motivates the drivers, what schemes, what pricing, what sequence of payments are the most motivating to these drivers. And I think that it probably has some broader implications. It obviously can do a very nice job at addressing some of the arguments in the economics literature over intertemporal substitution in terms of wages. And last, I think that it's always nice to cut these studies by segments and try to look, are there heterogeneity of response? So Kammerer's paper showed that really experienced cabbies know to wait for the big wages and then work really hard on those days, whereas the inexperienced cabbies tend to do the exact income targeting that violates the sort of standard economics principles. So it would be nice to know, actually, in the case of Uber, whether or not experience and information and training actually get them to behave in an even more opportunistic way that's perhaps even better for the total Uber environment. So with that, I think that's my presentation on Uber cabbies.